Thank you, first off, everyone, for hopping on. For those of you that haven't been on a webinar with me before, I'm Mark the Liberty. I'm the Director of Security Operations at WatchGuard. And so day to day involves keeping WatchGuard secure from the threat actors that would do us harm, while also managing risk within our organization, specifically around artificial intelligence lately, too. One of my roles is to make sure that our teams can securely use artificial intelligence to improve our overall efficiency without introducing risk into the company. And I'm actually coming to you, forgive the hotel room background. I'm coming to you from Las Vegas right now, where this week is the Black Hat and DEF CON cybersecurity conferences. We call it Hacker Summer Camp, where security professionals from around the world congregate here in the middle of the desert heat to discuss and learn about new security topics. And I have to say, like the biggest topic I've seen so far from day one yesterday at Black Hat was artificial intelligence. It's definitely a big point of discussion, big point of security research as well too. So I'm glad you were able to hop onto this webinar. And without any further ado, let's go ahead and get rolling. Quick look at the agenda. So I want to start with a look at the latest AI security trends. We'll talk about how artificial intelligence use is growing and even plateauing in some cases. Go over a few recent news stories about artificial intelligence, some overall statistics just to set the playing field for where we are now in the middle-ish of 2024. We'll then go over a few recent AI security concerns that have popped up in both research, including some just yesterday at Black Hat, and latest news posts as well too. And then we'll end with how you can create a artificial intelligence policy for your organization that lets your teams use this extremely powerful tool while maintaining risk for your companies. Before we jump in, I have a polling question I want to kick over to all of you. I want to know, what is your biggest concern about adopting artificial intelligence in your company? Are your concerns mostly around data privacy and making sure that your personal information and your company's intellectual property remains secure? Are you worried about incorrect responses or hallucinations from AI potentially um, steering whatever you're trying to use it wrong? Are you worried that this is just a rapidly evolving technology and in some cases really unproven? Is there something else? Please share it, chat, if you've got it. Or are you one of the few that really has no concerns at all, and you're just diving headfirst right into artificial intelligence? We'll give this just a few more seconds. I see quite a few responses coming in. This is good. Everyone's awake this early in the morning. And while I give it just a few more seconds to close out, Liz mentioned there is a questions box that you can put in any questions you have throughout this webinar. I've got it open on my end, and I'll try and answer them as we go through this and get to anything I missed towards the end of it. So I think, Liz, we're probably good to end the poll here. And it looked like around 75% of you said that data privacy was your main concern. And then the next biggest one was 14% saying just unproven technology. And I think that, pretty much aligns with what I was expecting. A lot of the recent research that we're seeing into security concerns for artificial intelligence use is really around data privacy and potentially stealing personal or intellectual property from organizations that are adopting AI. So, really interesting responses. There was one person that has no concerns, and hats off to you. Hopefully, by the end of this, well, not hopefully, maybe by the end of this, you'll have one or two that you'll need to help address. So to get us rolling, let's go ahead and start with the latest artificial intelligence trends. And I want to start with a interesting graph from the folks over at Gartner. If you're not familiar with their hype cycle of blank technology graphs, it's basically how they describe the life cycle of a new emerging technology, starting out with the innovation trigger, which is when a potential technology breaks through with really significant publicity. We could say in artificial intelligence, even though it's been around for quite some time, like ChatGPT coming out was really a big innovation trigger for specifically generative AI and these large language models. After that innovation trigger, you reach what they call the peak of inflated expectations, which is where we have quite a few success stories, but lots of failures along the way. But it's still really firmly ingrained in our society as a potential technology for folks to use. After we reach that peak, we go through the trough of disillusionment, which is where interest starts to wane a bit, and as applications fail to deliver, and the few that actually do provide some benefit really start to get firmly ingrained. Then we've got the slope of enlightenment, where the core benefits of that technology start to crystallize and become more widely understood. And then we finally end with the plateau of productivity, where mainstream adoption really starts to take off. The technology, or at least a few applications, are strongly proven, and it becomes widely used across different organizations. So last year, generative AI was at the very top of the peak of inflated expectations. And now we're starting to see some of those implementations aren't really panning out into usable products. And we're going down towards that trough of disillusionment now. And we're seeing this play out in the news as well too. There was recent articles just this month or last month talking about how big tech has been spending just billions and billions of dollars into different applications, and so far they aren't really getting any of their expected return on those as well too. um, you can see the likes of like Google and Microsoft, and to a lesser extent, Apple, really putting huge amounts of money just trying to see what sticks against the wall. And in some cases, we've got really good tools coming out of it. Copilot from Microsoft is a pretty strong tool. I'm sure at least a couple people use Gemini from Google. I know it's been popping up on my Samsung phone pretty frequently, but one of these days I'll find a use that actually sticks. And from Apple space, like their recent developers conference had some really interesting new features coming that are powered by artificial intelligence. But long story short, AI is an extremely powerful tool. And so far, we know a few of these places where it's working very well, like cybersecurity, software development, and even image recognition, which has been around forever in the world of artificial intelligence. But like Gartner pointed out, generative AI is in this phase where now we need to start weeding out some of the weaker implementations. Another thing that I want to go over is the European Union just put out, I guess last year or so now, their AI Act, which is this big piece of legislation that really tries to put guardrails and protections on artificial intelligence for anyone that operates within the European Union. And it does quite a few different things. So, first off, it establishes the European AI Office, which oversees the AI Act's implementation and enforcement within member states. They've got a stated goal to create an environment that still fosters innovation and allows us to continue researching and building really cool AI based tools, but at the same time, making sure that artificial intelligence technologies respect human dignity, rights, and trust. And they've got a few interesting guardrails that they're putting in place. So, for example, it establishes a process for grading artificial intelligence risk. And it even defines some requirements, including prohibiting AI that poses what they call unacceptable risk. And they've got a few examples of this. Anything that uses cognitive behavioral manipulation for specific people or vulnerable groups, basically trying to brainwash people using artificial intelligence, that's considered unacceptable risk, and that's going to be outlawed in the European Union. Anything that uses social scoring or classifying people based off of behavior, socioeconomic status, or personal characteristics is going to be outlawed too. I guess it's good for China that they're not in the that they're not in the European Union. Anything around biometric identification and categorization is considered unacceptable risk and it will be outlawed. And the last one is really interesting. Any biometric identification systems, including facial recognition, is technically going to be graded as unacceptable risk and banned. But like we all use facial recognition to log into our phones and our laptops. If you've flown through an airport in the United States lately, you've probably used facial recognition to get through security or board your flight. And so they have some carve outs and some exceptions for use cases, law enforcement as well too, but they're putting really strict requirements on how AI is being used for facial recognition and other biometric identification. And in the case of law enforcement, it's really backed by court orders as well too. Also established that there's obligation for high risk applications too. So these are like products that fall under the EU's product safety legislation. Think like toys or airplanes or cars or medical devices. And it requires a few things like an assessment before that product is put out onto the market, as well as ongoing assessments throughout its life cycle to grade its risk and make sure it's adhering to the obligations that they set forth. And it also sets transparency requirements like that content generated by artificial intelligence. So all of this is specific to the European Union. That's a big enough economy that a lot of these requirements will have spillover into organizations globally, especially from the big players like Anthropic or OpenAI, Google, Microsoft, Apple, whatever. Now, let's move on to a few specific artificial intelligence security concerns. And I mentioned to you, I'm actually coming live from Black Hat Security Conference. And just yesterday, I went and watched a presentation from a couple of researchers at Wiz that describe vulnerabilities they found in different artificial intelligence as a service or AI platforms. If you're not familiar with the concept of a AI as a service platform, just remember that to train a artificial intelligence model, it requires a huge amount of computing power. And companies don't typically have, or most companies probably don't have the capital expenditure to go out and buy 10,000 graphics cards to set up one of these training farms. And all these different platforms have popped up where they've got the hardware ready to go, and they give you an option for basically containerizing your AI model in one way or another and running it on their platform, either running the model itself or training the model, hosting the model, saving it, whatever. And they discussed yesterday and published a blog post a couple weeks ago on one of the specific topics about risks in artificial intelligence platforms. It was really interesting. In the case of like SAP, for example, they allow customers to run artificial intelligence jobs in basically like Docker containers and like a Kubernetes pod. Long story short, think like little small virtual machines that are supposed to be totally isolated from other machines. And unfortunately for them, the researchers found that not only could they gain basically arbitrary code execution in that environment, but they could escape their sandbox and own the entire artificial intelligence as a service platform and see every other customer's workloads, their data, and potentially gain control over all of that too. And it wasn't just SAP. At the talk yesterday, they went over Hugging Face, which is a really popular platform hosting AI models, and they were able to gain access to their entire infrastructure. And then another similar repository had similar issues as well too. So there's a lot of security research going on into artificial intelligence and some of the services that are popping up, and they're finding a lot of issues because just like 14% of you were concerned about, a lot of this is still unproven technology, and everyone's trying to move so quickly that sometimes they're ignoring potential or at least missing potential security concerns along the way. There's also been research into AI being used in social engineering. So there was a recent report from the folks over at the Identity Theft Resource Center where they found that job scams increased 118% last year, largely thanks to advances in artificial intelligence, helping improve the social engineering pitch. So if you're not familiar with a job scam, it's basically you convince someone that they're being hired. Typically starts with like a Craigslist post in the US or someone reaching out to you over LinkedIn. And once they've convinced you that you've got this job, they say, oh, well, you need to go pay for this training or maybe go pay for this like laptop or equipment, but don't worry, we'll reimburse you after the fact. Here's the payment portal to go make a payment for it. And so these victims will send off money to the attack. It's a like an investment that they'll get reimbursed when they actually start their job, and then they just get ghosted by the attackers. And artificial intelligence really helped make that social engineering hook more believable, so that the attackers can basically create a spearfish for this or their communications to the victim, run it through AI to make it just really sound human and believable, and have even more success with launching these scams against unsuspecting victims, unfortunately. If you've been following the news as well, you probably saw earlier this year, Microsoft advertised this new tool called Recall. which was a AI powered feature in their brand new Copilot Plus PCs that basically let users easily find something that they'd previously done on their computer. It works by taking screenshots at regular intervals to capture that user's activity on their machine. It then processes them using tools, including optical character recognition to figure out like text on the screen, and then stores them locally in a unencrypted database on the machine. And anyone that takes a step back and tries to consider the security impact of things like this immediately realized that this was probably a pretty bad idea. So it takes all this data, it exposes it to the user through an AI chatbot. But even though it is only processed and stored locally on the machine, it still introduces quite a bit of risk. One researcher actually demoed on a post on the site formerly known as Twitter how you could easily recover a password that was briefly visible from that database. Think like you're logging into a website. Maybe you think you mistyped a character, so you hit that button to quickly show the password, fix your mistake, hit it to hide it again. Well, if it took that screenshot right then as you were entering the password, its optical character recognition would pull out that password text and it would be saved in the database that is unencrypted locally on your machine. And what this means is any information stealing malware that manages to gain a hold on your computer could have access to everything stored in Windows Recall and steal secrets out of it that may have been captured, steal intellectual property or personal information. It's like a trove of information just waiting to be taken by threat actors. And as soon as Microsoft like talked about this at their developer conference or whatever, like the internet blew up with security researchers going, "What the heck are you thinking?" Microsoft, to their credit, pumped the brakes. I think they originally said they were going to have it be just for the Windows Insider program, and I think they've even just paused it entirely right now while they work out some of these potential security concerns. But it's this is what I'm talking about when I say that this technology is moving so quickly that sometimes even massive organizations like Microsoft that are security conscious don't really think about the potential impact that these tools could have on their customers or organizations. There was research earlier this year too by folks at Google's DeepMind and several universities where they ended up publishing a white paper last November detailing how they tricked ChatGPT into spitting back up training data just through prompt injection. And it, when it came down to how they actually did that, it was actually pretty dumb in how easy it was. So basically, they gave ChatGPT a prompt saying, repeat the word book to infinity. And so ChatGPT would sit there just writing book, 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 book. And eventually it would just start spitting out like gibberish. And then it would start spitting out like actual bits and pieces of training data. In some cases, it would just random text from online articles. In other cases, they used a prompt and got back a person's email signature that had been a part of training data, which included their personal contact information in there. All of this from just saying, hey, repeat this word over and over and over, which apparently caused ChatGPT to just have a brain aneurysm and start spitting out training data. This is a real concern, though, with any artificial intelligence model that's using generative AI. It's built off of training data that it's gathered from the entirety of the internet or in private models, potentially sensitive information within your company. And while we can add some guardrails for things we know about to prevent malicious prompts from potentially spitting things out, it's impossible to know all the potential ways that someone could trick a AI model through prompt engineering into potentially spitting out some of this training data. And that is a pretty major data risk for organizations. So now that I've kind of frightened you with a bunch of those threats, we'll move into how to build an AI policy that works. Before we get to that, I do see quite a few questions in here. So let me see if there's any I can answer right now. There's one that came through for, do you think homebrew or open source artificial intelligence tools are a safer option for businesses if they can afford the infrastructure to run them on? That's actually a really interesting talk, and I'll get into this a bit during the policy portion of this webinar as well too. One of my main concerns with open source or homebrew based tools is really a lack of support around it and potentially a lack of good like data protection practices for whatever's going in it. Now that said, I think your specific question was, what if I take a model from like Hugging Face that's very specific to something I need to do within my company? I spin up the infrastructure internally and run it all just internally. From a like data privacy perspective, that's actually pretty safe as long as you're sure there isn't any auxiliary code that might be sending off data back to something that the original model author owns. So from a data perspective, it's okay. My main concern would be around the ethical considerations and things like bias, where maybe you don't know exactly how that model works and it might be doing things that are unexpected. And this is where like hallucinations might become a big problem too. But that is a very, very interesting question. And thank you for asking that one. Let's move on. I think there's another one here. So we'd like to take advantage of new web blocker categories. So this is in the context of the WatchGuard Firebox, which include artificial intelligence. However, we need to upgrade the firmware. The hitch is there's an open issue for auth point authentication. Is there a workaround? However, I'd hope so. Basically, just asking how to make sure that you can make use of the new web blocker categories without triggering a known issue it seems you're encountering on 1210x. Um, I know that any known issues, we are attempting to resolve them behind the scenes. I'm not familiar with the specific one that you might be having with AuthPoint. I'd say if you already have a or don't already have a support case for this one, make sure you do, and work through the support case to get it resolved. If you want, you can reach out to me after this webinar, and I'll see what I can potentially do through the backend for you too. Let's see what else we got in here. So this was a comment, I think, to the original polling question we had. It says, our data privacy officer has a notable concern about AI adoption, but I feel like there's a lot of shadow IT on this. What's the best way of tackling this on endpoints? So this is around, like, especially if you've got a larger organization like me at WatchGuard with a whole bunch of different teams that all know they want to use artificial intelligence. Like, how do you know exactly who is using what within your organization at any point in time and what the potential impact is to the organization? And I think you have to start this discussion with Paul, which is why I'm glad you're on this webinar, because we'll talk about how you set this up from a governance perspective within the company and really set this foundation so that everyone knows what they need to follow. And then you can follow that up with technical controls to try and enforce that policy as well too. And from the endpoint with EPDR, for example, regularly reviewing the applications that are installed on a system can help. Using your network security controls to look for example, communications out to AI providers can be useful too. But as with most things in security and just IT in general, you really have to start with governance. And often that's enough. People just need employees that you work with need to know what's allowed, what's not allowed, and most importantly, why. And once you can explain that why to them, you can often get folks bought into your security program and your governance requirements. So there's a couple more. I'll get to them after a few more slides here, but let's keep on trucking on. So when building an AI policy, the first thing that you should probably consider is actually not typically a hallmark for cybersecurity governance policies, and that's the ethics principles. So you want to concern the ethical considerations for deploying AI to make sure that you're using it in a way that doesn't introduce bias within your organization. And that's pretty unique to artificial intelligence because we are basically taking something that could be considered not considered but acts very similar to a human. It can be biased in ways that a human could, especially if it's got improper training data. And I think with artificial intelligence, that's a really important thing to stop and think about and write policy standards around to protect your organization. You also want to consider data management rules. So how you allow that model to read or interact with data, or maybe don't allow it to read or interact with data within your company. You want to consider security measures for protecting that model, especially if you're using on-site deployments. Like the question just a little bit ago, if you go and use an open source model that you're running internally, how do you secure that deployment from potential tampering like you would any other application within your organization? You need to consider compliance and legal considerations, especially when using it on creative work. Things like copyright infringement is really easy to get into very muddy waters with artificial intelligence if you're using it incorrectly without some good guardrails. And then also training and education to make sure that your users are aware of the latest risks as they're using this technology. And let's start though with ethics and principles. And first off, you want to encourage employees to adopt and use models that have bias mitigations built into them, that promote fairness across different user groups. Basically, you want to make sure that you're not doing something that could potentially harm the individuals within your company or the customers that you work with. And this is something important to consider with artificial intelligence specifically, and should absolutely be a part of your policy. You want to make sure that you've recommended or at least require that models are transparent and have a explainable decision making process. And this is actually really difficult. And a lot of AI vendors are still working on this part too, because right now a lot of AI use is really black box, as we call it, where you put in a prompt, you get out an inference or the result from that prompt, and it's really difficult behind the scenes to like follow the decision path that that model took to explain why it returned exactly what it returned. So if you have the options between two different AI solutions to solve the same task, definitely lean towards the ones that have some transparency or at least an explainable process for understanding how it gets to the decisions that it has. I think right now in artificial intelligence, just the way we're where we are at with a lot of these applications, this is a pretty difficult one to actually meet, but it should still be part of your policy because I think thanks to legislation from the EU and the US, we'll start to see more and more model authors be able to give some of this explainable guidance for how they work. When it comes to data management, you want to make sure that you establish data standards for things like data collection and storage and processing. Similarly, like you would for any other application that you've deployed at your company, you want to understand how is it gathering information from your company, how is it being stored, what are the protections around not just confidentiality, but integrity and availability for that data within the model. How is it processing it? Who is it processing with? If you're in the European Union, you definitely want to consider any GDPR considerations around data collection and processing for AI. You specifically want to document requirements for protecting personal data and protecting company intellectual property as well too. Make sure that if your users are adopting a model, it's not just feeding all of your personal information and intellectual property back in as training data, because that could turn into a potential data breach at some point in the future. And this really boils down to requiring a clear data protection agreement with the AI vendors that you work with. And this often means going with, paid versions of something versus the free version, where the free version you may not have much control over the data protection agreement. You may not have much control over how your data is used after you've input it in there, or even the results that come out of the model and where they may also be used elsewhere. But when you start looking at enterprise grade models, you can often iron out these stronger data protection agreements to make sure that your users can use these tools without potentially impacting the confidentiality of the data that your organization cares about the most. When it comes to security measures, you want to consider the same security controls that you would have for any other application or system that you use in your company. This means if you're deploying it internally on your network, consider your security controls around network access to and from that system. Now, the servers that it's running on, or the containers that it's running in, and the endpoints that interact with it. Because just like any other application, a threat actor could potentially interfere with the model or the data it's collecting or the way it processes information and either steal information from your company or take out the availability of that model. And if it's something that you rely on for providing a service for your business to run, that could have a big impact on your organization. You want to mandate access controls around access to artificial intelligence models and artificial intelligence services. Same thing like you would for any other application, require multi-factor authentication and explicit authorization to use that model to make sure that only trained and authorized employees are able to interact with these. This is especially important if that model is going to ingest any sensitive or confidential data to make sure that you maintain that protection with only authorized individuals using the access. And then protect that model itself. This is most important for locally managed applications, like if you're going to take a open source model and run it internally, or use a service that you have to spin up and host yourself, either on premises or in your own data center or public cloud. You want to make sure that you are protecting that model from potential interference from a threat actor that gains access to your environment. When it comes to compliance and legal, this one's really easy. Just make sure that all AI applications comply with all relevant laws regarding, as well as regulations and industry standards. I say this is really easy. The section in your policy will be pretty simple. The actual implementation might be actually a bit difficult to govern and control, depending on what types of tools that you're using. And this is a space where it's going to be rapidly evolving over the next couple of years. Like the EU just released their AI Cyber Act that we talked about. The US has been rumbling about putting out some legislation around artificial intelligence safety and privacy concerns. And so you need to make sure that you are staying on top of the latest trends, the latest regulations coming out, and that your adoption of artificial intelligence doesn't go against any of those requirements. One big area to keep an eye out for is applications involving biometrics like facial recognition, especially if you're based in Europe, because that EU AI Act has really strong requirements about using or not using biometric based artificial intelligence. And then finally, training and education is going to be massively important. Like artificial intelligence is a rapidly evolving landscape. Your use of it is going to change pretty rapidly over the next couple of years. The policies that you build to govern this will also need to stay nimble and up to date with the latest trends or new applications and tools available. And this means you need to provide ongoing training for your employees on AI technologies that include things like ethical considerations and policy updates from your organization. This is a really great way if you are the IT person or the security person or the governance person for your company to really bridge that gap with users within your organization, the people you work with or the people that you work for, and keep them up to date on really the risks and concerns around artificial intelligence to make sure that they don't just go blindly turn on Microsoft Copilot on their work machine and potentially introduce data security concerns within your organization. And make sure you promote those risks of the awareness of AI risks and best practices so that your coworkers know how to use these technologies and tools. And all of this needs to be grounded in a governance document, a policy set out by you or someone within your organization to make sure that you can use these tools because they have great benefits and make some of them have great applications that make our jobs a lot more efficient while addressing the risk that they could introduce into your organization. So I'll go through now. If you have any questions, please continue to stick them into the question widget. I see at least a couple more in here that I'll get an answer to. And while we wait for more to come in, quick self plug, make sure you check out the 443 Security Simplified podcast. This week, we're putting out a couple of episodes with our recap from each day at Black Hat, and then a recap next Monday from the overall Hacker Summer Camp, including DEF CON, with interesting topics and briefings that we went and saw and what we think our actual takeaways and impacts are for the industry. So let me see one of these that came in. This was a comment during the initial polling question. It says, my concern is how artificial intelligence learns and who or what teaches the models. How do I know what I'm seeing is the objective truth? So this I would bucket into that kind of hallucinations category of how do you know like a generative AI, the output of it is actually correct? And this is where I think like if we take a step back, and I know there's a lot of concerns in different industries and roles, and we're even seeing some action being taken by some organizations about AI potentially stealing people's jobs. I don't think that that's actually like a major risk across our industry as a whole. I think AI will make our jobs a lot easier, but we're always going to need someone to act as that expert to interpret the results and look for those potential hallucinations that come out of it and make sure that whatever's coming out of the model is the truth or something close enough to the truth. I think right now we're in a spot where Depending on which system or tool you're using, it can be really difficult to know objectively whether something coming out is accurate or not. So right now, it does boil down to the same thing that hopefully you're doing for every piece of information you take in, and considering alternative sources and really fact checking the model, I guess, is the simplest way to put that. I guess there's no real easy answer to this one. This is going to be a major concern for specifically generative AI, with if it's indistinguishable from a human, and if it seems really convinced that what it's giving you is the accurate answer, we need to be able to take a step back, treat it with skepticism, and validate that whatever is coming from it is actual sound guidance as well too. Good question. Let me pop back in and see if anything else has popped in. So Dennis just asked, can you confirm that we will receive a copy of this meeting, please? This is being recorded. Liz will have to let me know if it will be actively sent out or just available for download, but it will be at least available on demand from our WatchGuard webinar center. I'm not seeing any other questions come in. I'll give it just another heartbeat here. See if, oh, there was one right here. So Ed is asking, what are the special implications for medical providers? And man, how much time do we have left? Okay, cool. So this is where it goes down to a bit of a rabbit hole where I feel like there's a lot of strong benefits for artificial intelligence applications in the medical space to really speed up the the time for receiving positive care or positive feedback for diagnosis, things like that. But there is massive risk with relying too heavily on artificial intelligence in the medical space without verifying the results that come out of it. Like obviously this is a place where it could literally be life or death. And if you rely on an AI model to, for example, tell you the dosage of a medication that should be assigned and taken by an individual, and if it got it wrong from hallucinations, or if it didn't understand the full context, like for example maybe allergies that the individual had, like that could have pretty serious ramifications. So that's my long-winded way of, I guess, beating around the bush and saying, in the medical space, it's one of the areas I'm actually most excited about artificial intelligence applications to really take a lot of the workload off of our healthcare providers. But we absolutely need to have healthcare providers validating the output that comes from these models, especially now in the short term where maybe we have fewer controls and fewer proof that the results coming back are 100% true. At a minimum, all of the same governance rules still apply. Securing access to the data, especially since now it's going to be data with HIPAA, at least in the US, HIPAA considerations. Securing access to the availability of the model, because if this is something you rely on in a medical setting and that availability goes down because it was impacted by a cyber incident, that could be damaging to life and health of individuals there. And then also just the ethical considerations become massively important in a healthcare setting where bias could potentially be introduced and give strictly wrong guidance or misleading guidance to the people that are relying on these. So I think everything still applies, but the special implications are it becomes more important to fully understand how you are using and how you're relying on these tools and services in healthcare specifically. And I'd even go so far as to say in any critical infrastructure capacity, if you do happen to work in one of the other critical infrastructure sectors. Great question. Let's see. I don't see anything else coming in. So I want to thank again all of you for taking time out of your day to hop onto this webinar. This is a topic I'm extremely passionate about, largely because it's changing so quickly and there's always something new to learn on it. And from a cybersecurity professional perspective, it's also an area where we still need to figure out exactly what we're doing to keep our users safe as they use these tools and keep our business safe. So thank you again, everyone, for hopping on. Hope to hear or see you again sometime soon, and have a good rest of your day. Thank you.